People say water has a memory, and if that's even half true, then the lake behind my house held every single version of the man I used to be, from the quiet mornings sharing coffee with my wife before the cancer took her, to the long afternoons teaching my son how to cast a line without snagging the weeds, and eventually the thousands of hours I spent just sitting on my hand-built cedar bench, watching the ripples and trying to find a reason to keep going after the house got too quiet. My name is Elias Thorne, and I spent 30 years as a senior hydraulic engineer for the federal government, managing massive dams and complex watersheds in places you've only seen on the nightly news. So when I retired to the sleepy little community of Heron's Reach, I wasn't looking for another project. I was looking for peace. The lake, or in quote, the basin in quote, as the old-timers called it, was the heartbeat of our neighborhood, a shimmering expanse of blue that reflected the oaks and the sky. And for 15 years, it was enough. The Homeowners Association was a joke back then, just a couple of retirees arguing over what shade of beige was acceptable for a mailbox, and I liked it that way. I stayed in my lane, kept my lawn tidy, and let the water be my constant. But then came a new board, led by a man named Julian Vane, a high-strung tech consultant type who wore Patagonia vests like armor and talked about, in quote, optimization, in quote, and in quote, asset leverage, in quote, as if you were managing a Fortune 500 company instead of a cluster of suburban homes. Julian didn't oppose see a lake. He saw a liability, a messy biological variable that didn't oppose. T fit into his vision of a sterilized, high-end resort aesthetic, and that's when the water started to pull back. It started on a Tuesday in early May, a morning so crisp it felt like glass, but when I walked my old lab, Cooper, down to the shoreline, he didn't oppose. T diving like he usually did. He just stood there, sniffing the air with a low, confused whimper. I looked down, and my heart actually skipped a beat, because where there used to be a gentle lap of water against the stone retaining wall, there was now 4 feet of exposed, stinking gray muck. You don't lose that much volume overnight from evaporation. Not in this climate, and not in a spring that had been as rainy as ours, so I did what any engineer would do. I went looking for the leak. It didn't take long to find it near the southern spillway, where Julian had recently authorized some, in quote, landscaping improvements, in quote, and there it was, hidden behind a screen of newly planted, non-native shrubs, a massive 6-inch industrial bypass pipe, crudely welded and angled to dump the lake's lifeblood directly into the county storm drain. I stood there, watching thousands of gallons of water vanish every hour, and I felt this cold, familiar weight in my chest, the kind of feeling I used to get right before a levee breached. I walked straight to the HOA office, still in my mud-caked boots, and found Julian sitting in his glass-walled office, looking at a spreadsheet that probably cost more than my first car. I didn't oppose. T-knock, I just walked in and laid it out for him, telling him that someone had breached the retention integrity of the lake, and that if we didn't oppose, T-plugged that bypass immediately, the ecosystem would collapse within a month. Julian didn't oppose. T even look up from his monitor for the first 30 seconds. Just let the silence hang there like a thread. And when he finally did, he gave me this thin, practiced smile that didn't oppose, to even pretend to reach his eyes. And quote, Elias, always good to see our resident alarmist, and quote, he said, leaning back and tending his fingers like he was about to explain the alphabet to a toddler, end quote. What you and oppose, re-seeing is part of our watershed modernization initiative, Phase 1, where we're simply recalibrating the depth to mitigate mosquito breeding and prepare for the new stone-tiered waterfront we've commissioned, end quote. I stared at him, my brain trying to process the sheer, unadulterated stupidity of what he just said, and I told him as calmly as I could that he wasn't oppose. T, end quote, recalibrating, end quote. Anything, he was killing the lake, draining the thermal mass that kept the algae in check, and violating about 6 different federal environmental statutes in the process. He just chuckled a dry, hollow sound and told me that his, end quote, consultants, end quote, had everything under control and that perhaps I should go back to my bench and enjoy the view while it lasted because, as he put it, end quote, the era of the swamp is over, end quote. I left that office vibrating with the kind of quiet fury I haven in oppose. T felt in decades, but I knew guys like Julian, they dawn in oppose. To respond to logic, They only respond to power, so I went home and pulled my old field kits out of the attic. I started taking daily measurements, logging pH levels, dissolved oxygen, and sediment displacement, and I watched as the lake died in slow motion. Within 2 weeks, the lily pads were rotting in the sun, the frogs had gone silent, and the smell. God, the smell was like a wet shroud of sulfur and decay that hung over the entire street. Neighbors started complaining, but Julian was ready for them. He sent out a glossy digital newsletter blaming the unprecedented drought and the legacy of poor maintenance by previous administrations, all while the bypass pipe kept screaming under the cover of night. I started a grassroots email chain, sharing my data and photos of the pipe, but Julian struck back fast. I woke up the next morning to find formal violation notice taped to my front door, citing me for unauthorized environmental interference and harassment of board members carrying a $500 fine. Then came the vandalism. Someone came onto my property and dumped a gallon of white paint over my cedar bench, the one I'd built for my wife, and I knew right then that this wasn't an oppos about the lake anymore. It was a war of ego. The following HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, and the room was packed with people who were starting to get scared because their property values were plummeting along with the water level. I stood up during the public comment section, my hands steady even though my heart was pounding against my ribs, and I presented a three-dimensional model of the lake's floor, showing exactly how the drainage was causing irreversible siltation. I told the room, Julian ISN and oppos. T just taking your water. He and oppos. S taking the foundation of your homes, because when that basin dries, the soil pressure shifts and your foundations are going to crack. You could have heard a pin drop, but Julian just leaned into the microphone, his face flushed with a dark, ugly kind of arrogance, and he said, Mr. Thorne is a bitter old man who can in oppos T handle a changing world. And as of tonight, his voting rights are suspended for repeated behavioral violations. And, he actually had the audacity to try and silence me in front of my own neighbors, but I just looked him dead in the eye and said, Julian, I warned you as a neighbor, and you laughed. Now I'm going to talk to you as a federal witness. I spent the next 48 hours on the phone with every old contact I had at the EPA and the Department of Natural Resources, and it turns out Julian had a dirty little secret. He'd been bypassing the county permits because the stone-tiered waterfront he wanted was actually a kickback scheme for a construction company owned by his brother-in-law. They needed the lake drained fast and cheap so they could pour concrete before the state inspectors noticed a lack of a liner, but they didn't in oppos. T-count on a retired engineer with nothing but time and a bone-deep grudge. I didn't in oppos. T just file a report. I built a damn case file that would make a prosecutor weep with joy, including timestamp photos of the bypass, water quality labs showing toxic nitrogen spikes, and a recorded conversation with one of the laborers who admitted they were told to, keep the pipe hidden until the job was done. When the state marshals showed up on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after the first drop in water, Julian was standing on his deck with a mimosa, probably, dreaming of his new concrete paradise. But his face went the color of curdled milk when they handed him the federal injunction. The fallout was spectacular, the kind of thing they'll talk about in Heron's Reach for the next 50 years, because not only was the HOA hit with a six-figure fine that nearly bankrupted the reserve fund, but the state ordered an immediate supervised restoration that Julian had to pay for out of his own pocket due to breach of fiduciary duty, clause I'd help the neighbors find in the bylaws. They had to rip out the bypass, dredge the toxic muck, and haul in thousands of gallons of treated water to jumpstart the ecosystem. And every single day, for 6 months, Julian had to walk past my house and see me sitting on my newly cleaned and restored bench, watching the water rise. He eventually sold his house and moved away, probably to some gated community where he could bully people over their curtain colors, but the damage he left behind took a long time to heal. The lake is back now, sure, but it's different, it's younger, more fragile, and it serves as a constant reminder of what happens when we let petty little men with big titles play God with the land. The funny thing is, a lot of people in the neighborhood still want an oppos. T talked to me. They say I, blew the whistle, on our own community and cause their dues to spike to pay for the legal fees. And they'd rather have a dead lake and high property values than a healthy one and a debt to the state. It's a strange world we live in. ISN and oppos. It, where the guy trying to stop the disaster is the villain because he made everyone look at the mess, but I don't mind the silence. I have the water, I have Cooper, and I have the memory of the lake as it was, and as it will be again. I sit there every evening now, and I think about how easy it is to destroy something that took 1,000 years to grow, and how much harder it is to be the one who stands up and says, and quote, no, and quote, when everyone else is looking the other way. So, I'm curious, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have kept your head down to keep the peace and watch the water vanish, or would you have burned it all down to save the soul of your home? I see both sides, I really do, but when I look at that blue horizon, I know I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat, fines and all. Drop a comment below, and let me know if you think I'm a hero of this story, or just the, in quote, grumpy old man, in quote. Julian claimed I was. I've been called worse, so don't hold back.